Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Dennis. I serve as Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's spring keynote with Erica Berry and guest moderated by Callum Angus. Sitka is located at Cascade Head on the north central Oregon coast and resides in the unceded traditional lands of the Indigenous people now represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. There is so much to learn as just one step that we can all take, especially if you're planning a trip to visit Sitka or the coast soon. We encourage you to visit the Grand Ronde Chichalu Museum and Cultural Center. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's event. Callum Angus is the author of the story collection, A Natural History of Transition from Metonymy Press, which was a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award in Transgender Fiction, the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction, and an Oregon Book Award. His work has appeared in Joyland, Orion, Nat Brute, and many other venues. He has received fellowships and residencies from the Sitka Center, Lambda Literary, Signal Fire Foundation for the Arts, the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, and the Seventh Wave, among others. Callum lives in Portland, Oregon, where he is at work on a novel and edits the literary journal Smoke and Mold, which publishes nature writing broadly defined by trans and two-spirit writers. This evening's talk is the second Sitka keynote event that Callum has moderated, and we are looking forward to the wonderful conversation that is sure to unfold tonight. So everyone, wherever you are, we can hear you, I promise, even if you are still muted. So wherever you are, make some joyful noise in giving a warm Sitka community welcome to Callum Angus. Welcome, Callum.
Thanks so much, Allison, and all of Sitka and Erica. It's my great pleasure and delight to have been invited to moderate this conversation. To be in conversation with Erica is delightful after finishing her book. So I'm going to just read a quick bio for Erica, and then we'll get on to the main event, after which point I'll return and we'll have a Q&A between Erica and myself, and we'll take questions from the webinar audience as well. Erica Berry graduated from Bowdoin College in 2014 and received her MFA from the University of Minnesota as a College of Liberal Arts Fellow in 2018. Her debut book, Wolfish, Wolf, Self, and the Stories We Tell About Fear, won the Oregon Book Award for Creative Nonfiction in 2024. As a writer and teacher, Berry's work often explores the intersection between feelings and the natural environment, and has appeared in the New York Times, Orion, the Yale Review, The Guardian, Eon, Literary Hub, Wired, Outside, Colorado Review, and The Atlantic, among others. She now lives in her hometown of Portland, Oregon, where she is a writer in the schools and an associate fellow at the Attic Institute of Arts and Letters. And she's joined us here today to give the talk, Circling the Wolf, What Kaleidoscopic Thinking Can Teach Us About Interconnection. So please, everyone, join me in welcoming Erica.
Thank you so much, Callum. It's such an honor to be here with you. And when I heard that you were moderating, I was already a big fan of your Substack. So I'm just going to make a plug for everyone who may not know. Callum writes wonderful newsletters, and I get so happy when they appear in my inbox about many of the themes that I'm also talking about today. So it's especially strange to be talking about interconnection in this Zoom sphere where I just sort of see you all as a number of people here. I'm sending this appreciation for your presence here on what is in Portland, a sunny day, relatively sunny right now, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Sitka Center, to everyone there. I remember sitting at Sitka right before I taught my first class and working on the Wolfish book proposal, getting up early before teaching to work on it years ago. And then I also remember being there finishing up the final proofs, sitting in one of the window seats in the cabins and sort of proofing that last version before it was going to print. So it's just been such a hub of interdisciplinary exploration and thought for me, and I'm so grateful to be a part of the Sitka community. So I'm honored to be here today talking about what I think of as kaleidoscopic thinking, and through the lens of my recent book, Wolfish, but hopefully in ways that are expansive and inspiring for you as you're thinking about other subjects in your own life as well. When I was in college in the early 2010s, I absorbed an idea that all environmental writers had to fall into one of two camps, Camp Doom or Camp Hope. I thought that my writing had to either stoke fear in the public or sell them rock solid solutions. And every couple months, I would read an amazing environmental essay that would bolster the value of one approach over the other, and my pendulum of allegiance would shift, and I would decide I should do the other sort of writing. But I no longer believe in such binaries. And more, I think the most important thing I can do as a writer in this space is just cultivate space for these conversations, period. To model for a reader what it looks like to hold the complexity of both hope and doom, sadness and beauty, and to make sense of how it feels to be alive right now, to help cultivate imagination as we enter the unknown. So this is where I think the image of the kaleidoscope comes in, or what I think of as kaleidoscopic thinking. To look at a flower in a kaleidoscope is to understand that a flower is no one thing, that your view is constructed and altered perpetually. Pick up a kaleidoscope and go into your garden and point it at something, and you'll notice that what you see is not your subject, but your subject changing, your subject refracted. Thinking kaleidoscopically means circling a subject that you can never pin down. It means understanding the way that two things juxtaposed together, look at two petals here, or a petal and a stamen, the way they're changing changes our experience of that thing. So two ideas, two colors, they appear different than they are in isolation when they are put together. And so to think kaleidoscopically is to not let ourselves see a subject as frozen in amber, as something to uncover a sort of cemented truth about, but to see it continually remaking itself to you. It involves humbling yourself to your own curiosity. Here are the UK and US covers for my first book, Wolfish, which was published last spring. And today I'm mostly going to talk about interconnection through the lens of this particular project, where I ask, what if I think about the fear-based narratives that enshrine real-life wolves, but also the fear-based narratives that enshrine my own life? And how might looking at the first perspective, a perspective rooted in looking outward towards science and policy, be informed by also looking inward at my own lived experiences of fear, both rational and irrational? I guess the question behind this is, why insist on the interdependence of these two subjects that bookstore shelves will tell me are very discrete? I think bookstores are some of the most sacred places in the world, so I don't mean this as any criticism, but the curiosity of never knowing what shelf this will appear on. I've found it on gender women's studies shelves, on anthropology shelves, psychology, nature, science, folklore, literary criticism, memoir. And I think if there are any booksellers on this Zoom, I would say that while of course my favorite place for this book is on the staff picks shelf, I suppose I'm also making the case for a shelf of sprawling, what I think of as omnivorous or kaleidoscopic works. There are so many texts in this canon, and so many of them that I've come across at the Sitka library. There are so many wonderful books in there that have inspired the sort of thinking that I'm doing. So I want you to walk away from our time together with some new approaches thinking about interconnection in your own life, and some new language for thinking about the inextricability of what I think of as the external environments and our internal environments. So who you are and who you are in the world, right? This book began as a more traditional journalistic book. I'll talk about that, but it metamorphized into something that was more sprawling and interdisciplinary. Like a wolf, this book roams across genre and discipline. As you might be able to see from these covers, this is a book very concerned with the stories, so often misguided, that we tell about our fear. It's really about coping on an animal level that I was grappling with very intimately in my own life, about how it feels to be afraid. What are the stories that you've been taught about fear? How do you internalize them? And how do you carry them on? At what cost to the world do we bear these stories? So one day I asked a biologist to talk to me about how wolves experience fear. And wolves, of course, are so often canonized in folklore as this sort of big bad wolf, this inciter of terror. And yet wolves, like humans, can be both feared and feared for. And the biologist said to me, he said, all wolves are born really afraid. So if there's a rustle in a tree, what's a young wolf going to do? It's going to go investigate that rustle. Which is to say, fear can look a lot like curiosity, and it can look a lot like inquiry. And, I was thinking about this in human contexts too, where last year I interviewed a therapist who works with ecotherapy and ideas of climate emotions, particularly for Outside Magazine. And he told me, a similar thing happens when we confront big feelings about environmental change. Emotions that we might imagine would shut us down, like grief or fear or anger, can actually, in the right circumstances, really catalyze these feelings of action, imagination, inquiry, hope. What I'm saying, I suppose, is that there's an interconnection between these feelings. And I just want to touch on this sticky word hope at the beginning of this talk, because I often feel like when I'm talking about environmental subject, people are sort of hunting for it. And maybe you're sort of doing this, like sniffing around the edges of what I'm saying, wondering like, how much hope does this person have if she's writing about an environmental issue? Often when I publish something, friends or family will say, I can't wait to read this, but is it going to ruin my day? Some of you will probably be familiar with the novelist Barbara Kingsolver. Many of her books engage environmental topics, and I like what she has to say about the difference between hope and optimism. She says she's hopeful, but not necessarily optimistic. The pessimist would say it's going to be a terrible winter, we're all going to die. The optimist would say it'll be all right, I don't think it'll be that bad. And the hopeful person says maybe someone will still be alive in February, so I'm going to put some potatoes in the root cellar just in case. I used to think that as an environmental writer, I had to be team terrible winter or team good winter, but I'm speaking to you now as someone in the root cellar, someone who wants to be envisioning a world where in this proverbial February, we will all be eating potato soup together, but also someone who knows we have a lot of work to do before then. There are three primary questions I ask myself when I think about environmental storytelling, and I want to share them with you because I think each in its own way is answered by thinking about interconnection. What is my relationship to my subject and vice versa? How am I defining this idea of environment? And who do I want this writing to reach? What do I hope it makes them feel and think? I'm just going to start at the beginning here. What is my relationship to the subject? This is my late grandfather's sheep farm. It's about 80 miles. I looked it up today from the Sitka Center on the coast outside Corvallis, Oregon. And I want to set the scene for you during which I began writing this book in the spring of 2013. At that time, I was spending the summer on my college campus in Maine. And the important detail is both that I had had a grant to research wolf repopulation in the American West and in my home state of Oregon. And also lobster was really cheap that summer. There'd been all this warm weather. It had caused a population boom of lobster, and the industry was suffering. There was this glut. And so lobster was cheaper than deli meat. So you can picture me, a college student, eating extremely cheap lobster and researching wolves. And why am I writing about wolves? Well, while spending Christmas with extended family in Montana that year, I'd seen a new bumper sticker on my uncle's truck. My uncle's a taxidermist, and I have a number of hunters in my family. I don't remember now if this bumper sticker was wolves, government-sponsored terrorism, or if it was smoke a pack a day with an image of a wolf pack seen through the eye of a target. Why does he hate wolves so much? I remember asking my parents. I actually don't remember what they said, but I do remember the feeling that being a sort of non-confrontational people pleaser type of person, I thought that rather than ask him directly, I should embark on like a decade-long research project. And I wrote an environmental studies thesis investigating centuries of rhetoric around this predator. I can't say I recommend this approach for efficiency, but it was an adventure. I'm glad I did it. I took this picture of a billboard in Eastern Oregon that summer that I was doing research. So this would have been around 2013 in Wallowa County. And I was beginning to realize how many different people had different ideas about what the real wolf was, what the truth with the wolf was. There were many different truths I kept confronting as I interviewed different sources. So along the way, I began to question the interactions that I myself have with wolves. One story surfaced, and I'm just going to read it. It's just a few paragraphs from the book. There's a story my Gramps likes to tell about one of my early visits to his sheep farm. I must have been 2 or 3, toddling. We're walking toward the barn, and I'm running ahead in grass already mowed to fuzz by the herd, probably chasing butterflies, those ones that appeared each spring to surf the breeze like shreds of lavender tissue paper. I turn a corner, round a hill, and stop. I've seen something, made eye contact with it. Gramps, I say, breathless, running back to his ambling frame, his boots nearly my height. A wolf. There's an animal ahead. Eyes glassy but alert. Neck hooked in a metal snare trap. As an environmentalist, Gramps believed in the conservation of wild spaces and their inhabitants, but here on the farm, he was also a tender, and he reckoned those two aims with seeming little angst. His responsibility for the sheep was love, but also business. His job was to keep the flock alive. On the ground, from a distance, the animal is my size, and for a second we watch each other. Her breath surely labored. Did she know she would die? Did I? She's not a wolf. Gramps knows that immediately. There are no known wolves in Oregon at this point in the early 1990s. My wolf is just a coyote. But I am a child and I know only stories, and the wolf in my stories looms big. The wolf is the beast that gets the sheep, and I love the lambs. I lean over the rose-colored bathtub and help bottle feed the ones whose mothers have, for whatever reason, turned away. What did I feel watching the predator? I would like to think I cried on instinct, aware I was witnessing a brink of death, but I'm not sure. There is a chance I may have felt like we had won, like this was the last threat, like we had saved the lambs. Or maybe, and this is worse to consider, I saw the animal I thought was wolf, and I did not realize that we had won. Maybe I thought the animal was still a threat, so I ran to grab my grandfather's hand. Maybe I saw panic in the animal's eyes and mistook it for my own. So this is a historic photograph from the Oregon Historical Society of a wolf from the early 20th century, and I think I've spent hours looking at it, trying to figure out what this wolf is experiencing. Is the wolf in a trap? Is it alive? Is it relaxing? Is it in pain? Until I was in college, it had never really occurred to me that there would be a controversy over wolf reintroduction, because it had never really occurred to me that they were gone. I wish I could say I understood their loss in the forest, but because I'd been born into it, I accepted it as norm. Scientists refer to this as baseline theory. I did not understand that wolves had been essentially hunted to extinction in the lower 48 by the mid-20th century, and so I assumed they were still out there. I assumed that one day our paths would cross. The year that I noticed my uncle's bumper sticker, one young Oregon wolf, OR7, was making international headlines. Many of you might be familiar with OR7. He was the seventh wolf biologists had caught and collared in Oregon, the offspring of wolves who had crossed the river from Idaho, and a descendant of the first wolves reintroduced to the Rocky Mountains and Yellowstone. He'd left his natal pack up here in the northeast corner of the state and started walking west, which in itself is not extraordinary. It's called dispersal. Many wolves will do it, young wolves in search of a mate or new territory, but this wolf just kept walking. He was crossing highways, he was crossing ranches, he was being picked up on, game cameras that folks had on their property, and this wolf walked right into the Western Cascades, searching for a mate in a place where no other wolves had roamed in decades. And suddenly, there's a lot of eyes on his path. To give you a sense of this moment, I'll just read a few paragraphs from right after he becomes the first known wolf in decades to step into California. Within a week or so of OR7's crossing into the state, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife created a Twitter account for him, sharing rough plot points of his journey while hiding his locations. Their bio for Wolf OR7: 2-year-old wolf from Oregon, left family to find wife and new home, was joined by fan accounts too, mostly run anonymously, like the Wolf OR7 Twitter. Bio: native Oregonian, California tourist, grew up in a troubled family. Hobbies: wandering, ungulates. And Facebook pages that classified the wolf as a public figure, where fans could come together to comment things like, "He is an amazing symbol of hope and strength," and "He's a beaut." By mid-January, the New York Times had published an article about the wolf's almost cult-like status. They quoted a senior policy advisor for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife who said that random citizens were calling the office, saying, quote, "We should find him a girlfriend as soon as possible and let them settle down." Others wanted to expunge humans from parts of the Golden State and revert the whole land to wolf sanctuary. "People are going to get wolf tattoos, wolf sweaters, wolf keychains, wolf hats," a board member for the California Wolf Advocacy Organization told the Times. The National Enquirer wrote about OR7. There was even a bumper sticker, OR7 for president. That same month, in early 2012, The environmental nonprofit Oregon Wild sponsored a naming competition. They wanted to publicize the animal, to make him so famous that nobody would try to kill him, and to mount him as a figurehead for wolf recovery. Hundreds of children submitted ideas to name him from as far as Finland and Nigeria, and when two girls picked the same name, the name rose in an online poll. Journey. Don't Stop Believing, read the subsequent headlines. So at the beginning, I told myself I was less interested in wolves than in following how people talked about them. I began to monitor these Facebook groups. I felt like I was sort of the watcher of the wolf watchers. OR7 was really the wolf that dragged me into thinking about wolves in this way. My calculus changed, and I began to think about my own life in relation to OR7s. One day, when I was in the library in Maine reading about wolves, and I got a call from my father in Oregon. And he told me that my mother was in the hospital and that she had a fever that was above 100 degrees, and it kept climbing. It would spike, then it would fall, it would spike and fall. And they were doing all these tests, but nothing was coming out positive. And finally, somebody thought to call an epidemiologist, who begins to ask her, where have you been the last few weeks? And he decides to test her for a tick-borne illness. Boom. My parents had been at a cabin on the Metolius River where a tick, likely borne by a mouse they'd found evidence of in their cabin, silently bit her in the night. You know, said the epidemiologist, I'd see a lot less people with tick-related illnesses if we had more predators like wolves in the ecosystem. That was all he said. One of my parents recounted it to me over the phone. We don't remember now who it was, but I remember so clearly hearing this and thinking, oh my gosh, the wolf is connected to me in this way I've never thought about. I've been thinking about wolves as creatures that I am appreciating for academic, for aesthetic reasons. I'm appreciating them as them, and that's really important. But it wasn't until I began to think about the tick that I realized the wolf and my body were connected, very literally connected. We were two animals in the same ecosystem. More and more often, we shared habitat. This was a habitat threatened by wildfires and drought, bisected by roads and subdivisions. We now know that wolves actually have a measurable effect scaring deer off roadsides. This research out of Wisconsin found that the presence of wolves keeps deer off roads, which diminishes human-car collisions. All human and animal bodies are connected in surprising ways. So I begin to think about my own life in relation to the wolves. For months, when I told people that I, a female college student, was traveling around the West alone to research wolves, they would make quips about Little Red Riding Hood. Be careful in the woods, they'd joke. Don't get murdered, haha. And actually, I said joke, they didn't joke. They said this seriously. And I think, this fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood is deeply encoded in the dominant Western DNA of what it means to be a woman in the woods and what it might look like to be that person encountering a wolf in the forest. The story says that a mother sends her daughter into the forest, the daughter meets the wolf and encounters harm. But I began to realize that what happened with the tick was a sort of inverse of this narrative. In that case, my mother had gone into the woods, she'd encountered a creature, and she'd ended up in danger. But in this calculation, the wolf wasn't the problem. The wolf might actually be part of the solution. A more balanced ecosystem could, in a way, make for safer hikes. So I was beginning to feel like I could not tell the story of wolves returning to the United States without telling a story about my body beside them. We were two animals, both affected by cultural narratives, many of them rusty and harmful. I didn't like the murderous rule that Little Red Riding Hood cast the wolf in, but I also didn't like the role it cast myself in. I did not like that girlhood had often felt like I was just waiting for bad things to happen to me and my friends. And to me, I began to fault Little Red Riding Hood for that. I realized that this was one story that had a very large shadow. And, in this version of this particular book I have an image of, I found it in the archives where she is stopping to look at flowers and squirrels, and that's where the wolf comes. And I just thought, I don't want the moral to be that the girl should not follow her curious gaze. I really want her to be able to pause for every plant she loves. So in magazine journalism, when I'm pitching a story to an editor, I've been trained to try to answer three questions. Why this story? Why me? And why now? Why am I the one writing it? Why does it need to be published right now? And I like these questions because they acknowledge that each of us has a different identity and thus a different lens on the world and our subject. Each of you would write a different book about wolves. One of the things I wanted to model for my readers was how to visualize themselves in connection, not only via ticks and habitat, but also via stories and language with the wolves in their world, right? All of these things connect us. We're connected both through physical things and we're connected through stories and a shared language for describing these things. So Wolfish, this book, really spins out of the idea that if I was to say the word wolf and all of you write what you think of when you think wolf, I bet we'd get 50 different images that would accumulate. And those are both real and symbolic. This is sort of a cultural core sample of what comes up if you're Googling wolf, if you're saying wolf. When I do this with college students, there's so much werewolf content. Werewolves are really dominant in how young people are thinking about wolves, I'm learning. The third picture is a wolf going to the bathroom at an aristocratic wolf sanctuary estate I went to in England. Very surreal. They would walk the wolves around. There were rescued wolves that I was there as a researcher. It was a very surreal experience. Here's some other things that might come up. When I was researching this, I went to the library and just looked through various news archives and searched for wolf. And so many of the incidences where a wolf is being written about was not at all about the Canis lupus, this biological wolf I began thinking I was going to study. It was about this, what I think of as a shadow wolf, a symbolic wolf. And I felt that to ignore those wolves in people's minds would be to ignore these icebergs of meaning that are always floating beneath the surface of day-to-day context, and they are really having a large sway on science and policy, but they're often thought of as not related to the subject itself. And so we go back to these questions, and I've begun to feel it was very important that we don't just ask, what does this subject mean to me? What does the wolf mean to me? But what preconceived notions about it do I carry? How does my life intertwine with its? As a writer, I often feel like I'm a witness of the world. I am here writing down my experience of witness. And when that gaze of witness is on, I forget that I'm also an actor. I realized I was not just interested in telling a story about wolf repopulation from the perspective of a so-called neutral or objective narrator. There are a number of brilliant wolf books that do that, but I really wanted to expose my own biases, assumptions, and perceptions about wolves, both real and symbolic, as a way of guiding my reader to begin to think about their associations. This associative muscle of thinking was really elemental to how I was thinking about the wolf. I teach a class sometimes at Sitka about braided essays, where I talk about when you bring in two strands of inquiry together. And for the online literary journal Brevity, Nicole Bright cites the words of art critic Eric Dean Wilson writing about diptych art. This is an example of a diptych by Andy Warhol about Marilyn Monroe, and he writes that each panel haunts the other. They throw energy back and forth. And I think I began to think about this in regards to how I was considering the wolf in my book. I was going to look at the subject of the wolf as it related to fear, but also I was going to think about fear in my own life and symbolic wolves in my own life. And I was going to trust that there was going to be this sort of perpetual motion machine, a feedback loop created by studying these two subjects. Most of you are maybe familiar with the term navel gazing. It tends to refer to narrative self-absorption, the author having a fascination with themselves. This slight tends to be inordinately leveled against women and other marginalized writers. Ted Kooser, former poet laureate, defines a poet as someone who stands beside a window and controls the strength of the sun outside. But I think this metaphor extends to the sort of literary nonfiction I write too. You can see in this picture, your silhouette will fade when the world outside is brighter, just as your reflection sharpens when the world is darker. Every time I sit down to write, I sit in front of this window fiddling with the lights. Who do I want the reader to see most clearly? It's true that a first-person author turns their own narrative presence up or down, but I've come to resent the choice between seeing my own body or seeing the world. When I say I am an omnivorous writer, I mean I am hungry to read and write about everything. I do not believe I have to pick between writing about the world or writing about my experience in it. I look at the world to understand my life, even as I mine my experiences to interrogate the world. I just want to think for a minute about this alleged insult of navel gazing. That was a navel, and this is a navel as well. Imagine writing about your belly button. Usually when we talk about navel gazing, we're not talking about actually writing about a belly button, but as an exercise, I'm just going to say, consider the belly button. Maybe it's a sort of lint specked innie that seems nobody cares about. And yet think about how that belly button is not only a bridge to one's mother, but a body's first interaction with civic infrastructure. When I look at my navel, or think about my navel rather, it's kind of hard to look at, I see the brown brick hospital whose windows overlooked the soccer fields where I later got kicked in the shin. I see my mother in the waiting room, moaning, while Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was on trial for sexual harassment on the corner TV. I see the silhouette of her doctor, dulled to the choreography of conjuring life, discussing an upcoming ski trip from behind a sheet as he cut my mother's belly open and pulled me out. I look at my navel and I see the hanging question mark of whether I one day will try to carry a child into this world too. Can you see that each navel has a different story, and that to tell a navel story is to tell a story of labor, not just of your own mother's, but of a system and environment around you? To imagine that writing about one's own life is not also writing about larger systemic inheritances is wrong. What I mean basically is that when we write about ourselves, we are writing about the world. And I think the writer's job is to make visible the structures that might otherwise be unseen. We live in a world of interconnection, but we exist in a society that often tries to deny it, to silo us into factions, into nations, into species, into careers, and to make us forget, for example, that the money a government spends on war is money they are not spending on education. These things are connected. It's the writer's imperative to illuminate the linkages between us and the histories we carry. The world is now dominated by an animal that doesn't think it's an animal. I'm not talking about wolves here, of course. I'm talking about us. We live in a uniquely precarious moment to be an animal of any kind because the world, to borrow ecologist Stephen Harding's words, is hemorrhaging species. And yet this blood loss is often invisible because we do not mourn the animals or the insects we never learned to see. I wonder if we writers have a duty to train our gaze on the bodies around us, but also on how our own systems and beliefs have affected them. So in Wolfish, I not only trace OR7's journey alongside my own journey away from home, both of us leaving Oregon, but I consider how the idea of a big bad symbolic wolf influences my life as a young white woman. And at first I was not sure that a book like this, which includes anecdotes from my own experiences, would qualify as an environmental story. I thought that I could not hold these two stories together, but I had succumbed to the myth of separation, the idea that what happens in one part of our life does not leach into another. Professor Matthew Schneider Meyerson has written that the root cause of the climate crisis and the nature crisis are not individual policies or desires, but worldviews, cultures, values, systems. What I mean here is that the stories we tell about the symbolic wolf are connected to the life of the real wolf. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning GQ magazine feature, A Most American Terrorist, The Making of Dylan Roof, it's a wonderful essay if you haven't read it. Black journalist Rachel Kaadzi-Gonza writes about the Charleston church shooter who murdered 8 Black congregants. In the process, she goes to the church that Roof's white parents and grandparents attend services, a place, she writes, where I cannot observe without being observed. So she's talking about the particular weight of being a Black woman in this space, but this concept applies in various ways to other subjects too. Whether or not we directly include our own perspectives on the page, we writers are not just witnesses, we are part of the story. We are actors. We are interconnected in the stories we are telling. And one day I was talking to my literary agent about this book, and I said I was talking about how fear shaped a prey animal's body. And she looked at me and she said, remember, you're an animal too. You don't just need to interview biologists to get answers on this. You can talk about your own experiences of fear. And I was really uncomfortable with thinking about myself as prey. I was also really uncomfortable about thinking about myself as a predator. And I began to realize maybe that was the point. And what I wanted to do was to model how a person could interrogate the stories they'd been taught to believe about their emotions, about the natural world, about being an animal. So this brings me to this next question, which is, how am I defining this idea of environment? This comes up in any story I'm writing because, spoiler, I think all stories are environmental stories. This is a mural that sits in Oregon's House of Representatives, and it depicts a scene in 1843, what is now called the Wolf Meetings, which At that time, you had French Canadian fur trading Catholics in Oregon who were sort of fighting with English pioneer Methodists. They're struggling to get along. And they call a meeting to discuss the problem of marauding creatures. Bears and mountain lions and wolves were all a problem, but these meetings have now been referred to as the wolf meetings. It was the time when people finally came together to agree on setting the territory's first tax, which was a bounty on dead predators. This bounty was very successful. White hunter would get about $100. Native American hunters would get half of that amount. And the success of this bounty led settlers to want to come together and establish a government. A year later, that same legislature voted that those people holding enslaved people should remove them from the land and leave. On the brink of joining the Union, my home state became the first in the nation with a Black exclusion clause in its constitution. So I went to high school in Oregon and I never learned this in history class. I had wonderful teachers, but I don't remember learning this. And I did not know that some of our first policies were about who, both human and non-human, belonged. These laws seemed to me to come from a similar drive to create a pure and safe environment for white settlers. These conflations between the wolf and the human other extend outside of Oregon too. There are stories from Glacier Park of game wardens chasing out both Blackfeet people and wolves, seeing both as a threat to the herds that tourists were coming to see. So in each, there's an effort to control who is allowed to hunt. So exclusionary narratives are about both humans and non-humans, and they're environmental stories, but they're also social stories. The villainous personification of wolves and the animalization of humans has long gone hand in hand. One night, when in graduate school in Minneapolis, I stumbled into an art museum documentary about the post-Iraq war trend of militarizing the American police. I found myself face to face with footage from inside a police training academy, referred to as a sheepdog seminar. The public are sheep, the officer explained on screen, and in need of protection from officers who are sheepdogs. Some people are just wolves, he told the officers in training. They will not hesitate to kill, so you have to get to them first. Now, when I went to that movie, I did not know that I was doing wolf research for this book. It was only just occurring to me that stories about our relationship with wolves were not just stories about environmental science and policy, but about human narratives around predator and prey. Statements like this are not only unfair to biological wolves, of course, because spoiler, wolves are not just bloodthirsty creatures out to get us at all times, but they have deep social implications. Around the time of that video, a man named Philando Castile was killed by an officer at a routine traffic stop in Minneapolis, and the officer, it later became public, had recently attended one such sheepdog seminar. So I began to understand that a story about real wolves had to be a story reckoning with a legacy of harmful wolf metaphors, but also about the people upon which those metaphors were weaponized. In her book-length essay, The Second Body, British writer Daisy Hildyard makes a case for each of us having two bodies. There's a physical one contained within our skin and a messy one that spills beyond it. Climate change makes every animal body implicated in the whole world, she writes. She reminds us that a whale's lungs are infused with our cigarette smoke and our dust, and when that whale dies, her dissolving corpse disperses back into the sea, where it is likely to be eaten by a shrimp and then by you. So in this light, the charade of selfhood is false. Interconnection is life. To imagine that thinking about oneself is not also writing about larger systems is wrong, and I find my goal as a writer is often to help the reader see their body in union with the world. I think good environmental stories make interconnection visible, and this interconnection is often beauty. It's a source of awe. When I think about grief now, I think about how scattered human ashes are changing the soil chemistry atop some mountains, and then about how the griefs that I carry have changed my own chemistry too. Or take the seedlings of northern oak trees, which I recently learned are so quick to grow back, ecologists now think, because they may have evolved when elephants were trampling them. We are not so far from extinct prehistoric creatures as we would think, and now when I walk in the forest and imagine the elephants who walked there before, I find a new glaze of awe on an act that can, on my worst days, feel like dragging a skeleton through a burning planet. Melodramatic, but sometimes we have those days. So what I mean is that finding interconnection is a way of finding beauty for me. I always ask myself, what sort of story do I want the reader to go on, what kind of journey. And research shows that reading environmentally focused climate fiction novels makes readers more concerned about climate change. So say that I want to convince my reader that what I'm writing about that I think is important to them. Unfortunately, the research shows that this doesn't last for very long. After a month, the effects of reading this climate writing has diminished to statistical non-significance. So the researchers conclude, in order to reach these readers, we have to have a steady stream of environmental narratives. To change minds, we need to be constantly immersed. But how do you get people to pick these narratives up, especially people who do not care? Well, I would ask you, how do you feed a dog a pill? The idea of the Trojan horse, right? Researchers found that it's more likely that stories that don't advertise themselves as related to nature or the environment or climate change will actually reach an audience about those topics. A story about Little Red Riding Hood can also be a story about ecology and vice versa. Highlighting interconnection can be a way of opening doors to multiple people and readers. I'll end by inquiring if there are any birders in the audience. I'm going to pretend like I can see you nodding. I'm sure there are. I recently learned the term spark bird, which people use to talk about the bird that got them interested in birding. And 11 years ago, when I was a college student sitting in those musty stacks, reading about this celebrity wolf in the tabloids, and eventually about tick viruses and Little Red Riding Hood, I didn't realize that the wolf was going to be my spark bird of sorts for thinking deeply about interconnection with non-human life and the ways that our language around it in the world actually affects this physical environment and vice versa. The act of writing is almost comically about being in your own head. Any of you who've sat down to write know how inward facing it can feel. And yet, by writing about wolves, I began to understand what it means to move through the world in an entirely different animal body. So I'm just going to finish with a quote from the end of Wolfish, where I write about how my perspective around wolves and interconnection has changed. We don't exist with wolves in a boxing ring, but on something like a crowded dance floor, our shadows overlapping as we come in and out of contact with other species and one another, touching lives in nearly untraceable ways. I started my research by bringing attention to the wolf, but with enough time and space, attention becomes omnivorous. The shadow wolf led to the real wolf. The love and the ethics spilled outward. Maybe the wolf had dragged me onto that dance floor. Really, I'd chased it. But now I was here, surrounded by a texture of life I'd never let myself see, and all I wanted to do was keep trying to imagine a world where we could all stay. Thank you for sharing your day with me. I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was a wonderful talk. I have so many more questions than the questions I started out with coming to you after reading your book. And I know we've already got one question in the Q&A and lots of hearts going. So I'm just going to jump right in and begin this. One of the things I wanted to start with was actually you shared that map of OR7's The Wolf, who's tagged and then is able to be GPS tracked through Oregon, whose story you follow in the book as well. And one of the things I really loved about the book especially was how you bring that story of paralleling OR7's journeys with your own journeys moving in and out of the state, but there's no neat and tidy conclusion to that. And I don't think that's like spoiling anything. I think even given your talk now, it's clear that like a wolf like this, especially in our world, isn't going to have a happy ending or neat conclusions to their lives. And that looking at that map again that you shared in your presentation, it actually felt a lot like it mirrored also the wandering of our attention as you steer us through your very voracious curiosity and intellect throughout this book. And it strikes me that another binary that you complicate is that of attention versus distraction throughout, which is really interesting to me. And you said, I just wrote down a quote from your presentation: I look at the world to understand my life, and I interrogate my life to understand the world. And so I guess I would love to hear you speak a little more about like your stand on this supposed like cavalcade of distractions that we have in the contemporary world on social media, all these things. Whereas when I'm reading your book, I'm seeing you go in all these different places, and yet you bring it kind of back into this swirling vortex of stories and things that there is it does feel like I don't know, you rescue some of these stories from being sloughed off. So that's kind of a lot of different things
So
brought up.
beautifully said. I feel like I need to think about this I'll be wake up at 2 a.m. and I'm gonna like have ideas about this. I think the first thing I would say is that I did think about my own process ultimately as wandering wolf-like. And, a wolf, it doesn't look logical when you look at this sort of coiled string path. And I think that creativity is so much like that too, setting out to do research. The metaphor I use is of beachcombing. I was watching a woman with a metal detector on the beach. And I thought, okay, she's looking for a lost wedding ring or something. I had this whole story of what she was searching for. And in fact, she was just looking for any shiny thing that made the metal detector activate. And that's how my research process is. Sometimes I know I need to figure out where was OR7 the day that I sold my book, the day that I da 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 da. I was sort of mentally, I'm tracking this. And yet, actually, what I'm doing is like, what are any interesting wolf things that just catch my attention in a sort of like magpie-like way? And I think, letting there's a lot of permission giving that I had to give myself as a writer to say, what if I go and explore this thing and then I explore this thing, but I don't want to lose my reader, so I'm going to reach out a hand and we're going to be kind of in this whirlpool together, but I want to bring them back. And how do I build that trust with them? And I do think that, any of us who've spent time on the internet with many tabs know the allure of just continually click, 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 open, open, and not being able to go deep. And in some ways, the act of just thinking about a wolf for 10 years, or what does a wolf mean to me for 10 years, was an act of going deep by nature of also going omnivorously, like going very broad. And, if I had another 2 years on this book, I would whittle it down and I would expand it. So there's a kind of constant contraction there. But I think it's very akin to the creative process, the wandering wolf.
Thank you. Yes, I feel that. More years on the book. We're kind of always continually writing these books. Even when they're finished, we just have to arbitrarily say, okay, it's done. And on that note, I am curious about your decision to structure the book in this way. Each chapter, for those who haven't read it, is titled either like Girl v. Wolf or Mother v. Wolf, Country v. Wolf, v like versus, right? And in a way that kind of feels very contrasting to your idea of the kaleidoscopic thinking, which I really love that term kaleidoscopic thinking. In my head I've been saying for a long time, like trying to write with something instead of about it as a subject. And you've, I think, given me some language to think about that more precisely. And I guess I'm curious, like, how did you end up naming these structures in this almost like lawsuit style from, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think, it came from a desire to make this sort of wolves are seen in this sort of Western heteronormative mainstream context as so on this as the opposer. There's this battle. And so I wanted to make that visible as a way to dismantle it essentially. And it begins with this sort of most elemental wolf versus girl idea that I is internalized for me with Little Red Riding Hood, and then kind of wolf versus town, these narratives. And then as it gets bigger and bigger, wolf versus world, wolf versus self, it breaks down. You think like, what is the point of this binary? How does this make any sense? How is it wolf versus, And so I saw the gaze as sort of zooming out and making, in a way, highlighting the sort of contradiction and the impracticability of wolves cannot be this opposer. The thing that the wolf is opposing, sometimes we are the wolf and we're opposed to the wolf, so this is very much a book about complicating those easy battle lines, I think, between self and other. I'm interested in challenging the ways that we define ourselves off of, hey, that creature is over there and it's different from me, so this defines who I am. And I wanted to look more at what we share. And so those titles began, I did think of them, court cases or boxing matches or some sort of matchup that, of course, the wolf is not a part of. The wolf never knows that it is competing with us in this way. So it's all our sort of fan fiction where we imagine the wolf playing this role, that it's just being a wolf.
Mm, cool. Yeah, I knew you'd have something to say about that. I loved it. It was really great. Let's see. Well, let's stick then with some of this like wolfy girl. And I know there are questions in the chat, and I'm going to bring those in. Thank you everyone for asking those. I do want to make sure though that I also cover the connection between women and wolves in the book and the role that gender is playing in throughout all of your different essays here. And I can't remember now, I have this note written down that I don't know if this was a quote from you or if it was something that you kind of wrote about at some point, but just about women and wolves being stuck in narratives that define them struck me as like a beautiful sort of clarion call for why this book exists. And then you have the essay about wolves and mothers, and where you write that if a human mother was to blame, only then could the wolf mother be redeemed, and the really like intricate relationship between wolf mothers and real mothers. And I really appreciated the way that you mapped the myth of American families onto wolves and onto just our view of nature in general, like with the ticks and such too. And yeah, I guess that's not really a question, but I guess I wanted to hear more from you about where you think that family connection will be displaced onto, as we're sort of at a moment in time where we're struggling with our like familial relationship to other species and to environments, and like are we kin with them? Are we like facing off, squaring off against them? Are we trying to save them? Are we their saviors? Like, but
Yeah. No, I think it's so interesting how you're pulling these things together. And I think, the ways that we think about family, we're sort of reinterrogating culturally a lot of those narratives at the same time that there's changing science and people are beginning to understand, oh, alpha wolves don't exist. The idea of the alpha wolf was from a harmful experiment that was looking at wolves in captivity that were not connected. It's kind of like looking at humans, like incarcerated humans, and saying, this is what a family structure looks like. It's not family in the same way, right? And so this idea of we understand so much of how we think about human families is sort of refracted through these science that's trickled through, or the language of metaphor, right? The most innate sort of ways we describe. And when one of those things is off balance, like I think right now we're in a moment of maybe perhaps evaluating both, perhaps saying, there's been studies about gay animals, and like animals are living in ways that have not been known to sort of the dominant awareness. And so alongside people realizing these things about animal and plant life, we're also realizing, oh, like maybe our families need to look different too, or could look different. I was really inspired by so many stories about wolf packs where it's not just a nuclear family raising children, it's the stepmothers and the sisters bringing the food and regurgitating it, and it's this real unit of interconnection that to me was so evocative and really felt like what, writing this book during the pandemic, I was really craving for my own sense of family, was something bigger and looser and more community minded in a way. And, so often we think about wolves as this kind of lone wolf figure, when in fact, wolves are such incredible community creatures. And I began to think, like, what if the image of the wolf that America was valorizing was not the lone wolf alone on the hilltop howling at the moon, but like was the scrappy sister coming back to regurgitate food for her niece. Like, isn't that a beautiful image of a wolf too that we can learn from? And so I'm really interested, as someone who, I get asked a lot about anthropomorphizing and are you looking at the wolf just as a metaphor for the human? And I think they're not mutually exclusive. Like, I want to look at the wolf factually and scientifically and understand and appreciate the wolf for being a wolf, and also say, I'm a human trying to figure out how to live my best life as a human. And so you bet I'm looking at this wolf and thinking, this is a beautiful way that they are connecting, or, I'm inspired in a way by the natural world constantly. So I'm going to let there be a feedback loop there.
Oh, thank you. Beautiful. Okay, I must bring in some questions now. And I think this first one is nice because it asks a little bit about fear, and we can connect this to some of your writing about fear too. And it's from an anonymous attendee. They ask, there's no answer to this, but I'd love hearing what you have to say about this quote fear that I have. My fear is that because I'm 78, it's too late for me to finish my novel, create a blog to share my perspective on issues, etc., and too late to make a difference. So I think they, and as well as me, would love to hear what you have to say about that, and maybe also folding into that you write through a lot of fear in this book and write about it, and maybe sharing some of your writing fears that you had while you were writing would be helpful too.
Yeah, thank you for your vulnerability with this question, Anonymous. I relate so much just to the fear of putting your voice on the page. It's terrifying to do and to say, hey, there's space for this. Nobody is waiting on our writing. It's not like bills that need to get paid or food that needs to be given to the dog that's whining. Nobody is whining for our writing usually. But I would say that, that idea that I mentioned at the beginning of a wolf that's afraid, the fear actually becomes a form of like, that thing's kind of scary, so I'm going to go look at it more. And at one point early on, when I was writing this, a therapist said, you're writing about your fears, you're writing about things that scared you. That's probably bad. I think you should stop doing it. And I kind of spent an afternoon reading up on fear and like trauma and psychology, and that's wrong. There's a way that you have to go into it carefully, but there's a processing that happens when you look directly at the fear. And I was never afraid of wolves, but I was afraid of things that I write about in this book, and writing about them made me less afraid, the process. So I would say acknowledging what you are afraid of and write about that idea that it's too late, and see what happens when you sit in that space. And my guess is that you would find other readers that really relate to that idea, and that in the act of sort of grabbing it by the shoulders, the idea, you would come to some new braver way of thinking about it. I mean, I think about the idea that bravery is not a lack of fear, it's just sort of going on in the face of it. And so I think, so much of creativity is in the face of anxiety about whether this project will work out, doing it anyway. And I was very worried about this book. Early on, an advisor had told me it has to be 2 books. One is about your fears and one is about wolves. And congratulations, you have your next 2 books. And I was like, writing 2 books seems a lot harder than writing one right now. I have one idea for one. Let's just try. And I had to sit with a long time and consider, what if this person's feedback, I really respected her, but I thought she was wrong. And I had this idea, maybe I have to prove her wrong, and I have to do a better job of writing so that she can understand why I'm telling these stories in an interconnected way. And so, sometimes I think hearing a certain kind of criticism can actually be helpful for me. It sort of motivated me to say, okay, this isn't clear yet, but I'm going to write into this space of doubt and surprise her, and by proxy, myself.
Yeah, I think we always write the book that we need most in the moment, right? Both for you and for this question asker too.
Best of luck. I have faith and excitement.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question in the chat asks broadly, do you see improvements in people's attitudes toward wolves now?
Yeah, I just actually wrote an op-ed sort of about actual politics around this for the Times, where I was quoting a survey that finds that in places where wolves have been established for a while, the number of op-eds that are mad about them in papers go down. Like the language around the polarization around the wolf decreases. And that was really hopeful for me, because in places like Colorado, where wolves are just coming back, there's a lot of contention. They're deeply polarizing. But everyone I've talked to in Oregon, by and large, will tell me, when you started researching this in 2013, reporters were getting death threats for writing about wolves. And now it's a little more normal. You have livestock producers who are learning and collaborating. There are groups that are helping them think of these, non-lethal ways of managing wolves and retraining their cattle. And it's actually less of a hot button issue here than it is in, say, a place where wolves are just coming. So I have hope that we are learning to live beside wolves again, the way that humans have lived beside wolves for tens of thousands of years. I was just in Montana and Idaho the last few days with family, and I was frustrated all over again because of the ways that wolves become caught in this political volley. But I think, the more we can remove wolves from polarized debates, the original wolf repopulation was voted on by both Republicans and Democrats. And so I think letting wolves just be wolves and not symbols of our own partisan politics feels really important to me. So I do have hope. And also, it's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nina, I'm still gonna answer your question, but I want to move to Ryan's first, because it's actually a question about wolves as symbolic versus real beings, which is what we're talking about. So he asks, he's struck by how the human notions of wolves as symbol or wolves as myth make them challenging to write about or talk about rationally. And as you worked on Wolfish, did you resist that lens? Did you use it as an entry point, or both? Did your research or experiences change how you think about wolves as actual versus symbolic beings?
This is such a good question. And it's really absolutely at sort of the seed of what provoked me to try to write this project was that I felt like I could not see this real wolf. I sort of thought at the beginning, I'm just going to go in and just write about the science of the rational wolf and boom, boom, I'll be done. But there's many writers that have like tried to do that and done that. And there's this sort of cultural taxidermy, I call it, as the wolf that is created with these myths and stories, a composite of all these stories. And it does make it really hard to see the real wolf behind that, as you say. I would say that I talked into that lens. I tried to make very obvious the ways that language that was talking about the wolf as a symbol leached into how the wolf was being talked about. I'll give an example. You have these border patrol officers who are working with wildlife along the Canadian or Mexican border, for example, in the early 1900s. And the language they're using to talk about wolves coming in from Canada or Mexico to the States is language that's coded with a sort of xenophobia toward immigrants, the idea of wolves as outsiders. And you see this actually in Germany right now. There's a number of sort of refugee wolf conflations. And I think looking at those examples, I'm trying to make visible for people that we are talking about a wolf in, say, policy terms, but actually it's informed by this idea of the wolf as a dangerous other in human terms. And if we can separate those things, that is one way to improve the policy conversations we're having, I think. So I tried to grapple with it pretty directly and call it out.
Thank you. That's great. I do want to ask Nina's question, which is asking, did you have any dreams or personal connection to wolves prior to your curiosity to write about the decision to write about them?
I would say I have had sort of experiences with them, more specifically with coyotes. There was once in my childhood where I woke up in the middle of the night, and I've only done this once in my life. I thought I have to get up and go to this window across my bedroom. And I went to the window, and there was a coyote standing in the middle of a streetlight. And I was so moved watching it in this urban space. And I felt like I'd had experiences with foxes and coyotes. And so I hadn't exactly been around wolves, but this sort of idea of the wild canine was really present in my psyche. And I was really interested in sort of what that made me feel, because it was a whole bunch of awe. And I always think following awe is a good engine for creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, there's one more question in the chat. So they ask, if in your research, did the coastal Canadian wolves, genetically distinct from other wolves that can swim or hunt for fish, bring up interesting things for you?
I really adore the photographs of these wolves, that if you have not found them, I recommend everyone go Google the wolves with fish. I honestly, this was an area I did not explore as deeply as the wolves sort of in Oregon. I know they're up in BC, and I would have dreams of going up there. And there are interesting things about people living near the sea and those experiences of like being on Vancouver Island with wolves, and there's sort of specific human wildlife conflicts that have come up with those sea wolves. But I don't know that I have anything really smart to say about that. So maybe that's book 2, the sea wolfish.
Absolutely. Great. I feel like I would be remiss to ask you this question that has been on my mind since finishing the book. And it first struck me when you quote someone who wants to shoot wolves in, I think, rural Oregon, or from a story or an article, where he says, my personal opinion is, if somebody is breaking into your house and stealing your money, you have the right to shoot. Then he's talking about wolves killing the lambs and other livestock, which is the main reason that a lot of ranchers don't want wolves around. And of course, you write about whiteness throughout this book. You grapple with race and the symbolic wolf's relationship to racial relations in the US especially. And that quote in particular, he's talking about wolves, but he could also be talking about white settlers coming into the American West and Oregon specifically, and taking land, destroying lifeways of indigenous peoples here. And in your presentation, you kind of very clearly articulated your mission as a writer, which is to help readers connect their bodies to the world. And so I'm curious if you, as a writer born in Oregon and who grew up here and has this deep relationship to these like rural communities, ranching, agricultural peoples, like, do you have something that you want to say to them, or like how do you see yourself as speaking to that population of folks who may or may not consider themselves settlers yet, but like where they engage in this relationship to the land and to the peoples who were here first, and the sometimes conflicting worldviews that they have?
Yeah, thank you for that question, which I do think gets to the heart of early why I started writing this book, was trying to write to people that might not think they wanted to read a book about wolves. And sometimes that was because they were thought maybe consider the wolf harmful to their ranching practices, but maybe they just didn't care about wolves. And like, why does this have to do with me? I think I'm thinking about an idea that has come out of these collaborative environmental groups that are very focused on building coalitions between different groups. So maybe tribal groups, and you have livestock people, and you've got like these ideas of how can we think about, say, predator prey management through coalition building. And the idea is of a barbed wire fence, the metaphor that is used, where we think about a barbed wire fence as being about the barbs, but actually the majority of the fence line is smooth, right? And so whenever I'm talking to someone, I am trying to focus on what the smooth things are that we are sharing. And very often, it's understanding that a lot of livestock producers see themselves as stewards of the land and environmentalists who want that land to be not a subdivision, not a city in generations. And that's actually like a shared goal with the tribal folks that I talk to, or with, maybe a wolf advocate who would say, I don't want ranchers here. They're harming wolves, but actually they're conserving this wild open space. And so I think focusing on the listening part of this, like I'm trying to model in this book a form of listening across these binaries. And also, so you said, what do I want to say? And partially I want to say, like, I just wish we all listened to each other more and like sat down and were thinking about what our shared goals are, and our shared, being able to slow down. I had an experience with a rancher who was looking at a wildlife camera on her property, and she was going to show me where wolves had passed in front of the camera. And as we're going through this photos that I've taken, she's like, oh, that's a mountain lion. That's 2 mountain lions. That's 4 mountain lions. Oh, that's 6 mountain lions. And then she looked at me and she was like, I'm scared of wolves when I go out walking, but I guess maybe I should be afraid of mountain lions. And my goal is not to sit here and say we should all be more afraid of mountain lions than wolves. But I did have the realization of like, I'm not saying anything. I'm just asking her to show me the pictures of what's going on. And she's realizing like, maybe my fear of wolves is not actually grounded in the reality of who is out there. It's more grounded in these stories. And so that was a cool example of just like listening and talking. We were both coming to realizations about that. So having conversations, I've had wonderful conversations about this book with many different kinds of people, and it's a gift to get to have those open doors.
Mhm. Thank you so much. I know there's one more question asking about bridging the gap between politics and nature. If you have something else to add about that, you're welcome to, but I think you kind of speak to that very eloquently already in many ways. And so, I'll leave a little space here, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming and giving this talk and for writing this book that I think a lot of people will read and love and learn a lot from. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. And thank you for that last one about politics and nature. Again, I would say like focusing on the smooth parts of the barbed wire and trying to depoliticize the wolf insofar as we can talk about people coexisting with this animal for many, 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 many years. So thank you so much, Sitka Center, and all of you for coming.
Thank you, Erica, for sharing your work with us, and quoting Callum, but for sharing your voracious curiosity with us. And Callum, thank you for curating such a thoughtful and warm and enjoyable conversation tonight. Thank you, Sitka community, for coming out. We had over 80 people from all over the place participating. We only have 20 parking spots at Sitka, so it is so exciting to have so many of us coming together for this event. With that, I'll wish everyone a good night. Thank you, everyone.